Just a few notes here that are a little bit, instead of messy, I'm going to say eclectic. That sounds so much better to say eclectic, right? It means they don't necessarily match, but they're chosen on purpose. So just a quick review. You remember Isaiah? That was the first of the major prophets that we had over on our shelf of prophets. He's about 700 BC, so that's when Samaria fell. And then all these three guys, the other three we talked about, Jeremiah, and of course he's the author of Lamentations, Ezekiel and Daniel, are all at the same time. They're contemporaries about 100 years later. So Isaiah is about the time that the northern kingdom collapsed, and then about 100 years later, in round numbers, is the time that the southern kingdom of Judah is going to collapse. And so these three guys were contemporaries. And I put this here that these two actually lived and did their prophecy in exile. So they were part of the groups that were sent out. So that gives us a little bit of context. Now I want to have a little question. Put these four names here at the bottom. It's Joseph, Nehemiah, Daniel, Esther. What do those names, as you think about the stories of those people, at least one thing I know they have in common, but y'all might come up with something else. What would you think when you think about those names in their lives that was something in common with those four people? Joseph, Nehemiah, Daniel, and Esther.
Opposition. Enemy.
They were.
Is that not what you wanted? Sorry.
No, I'm just trying to understand. So enemy in terms of...
Somebody openly opposing them, trying to get them, trying to...
Okay, yeah. So they were, yeah, they definitely had opposition.
They were not in their home area. They were exiled.
They were all exiles for a part of their life. We're getting a lot more. That's not even the one, but that one. Those are both good. We're going to get to mine, though, as well. I knew y'all would, smart group, y'all would come up with some more. What are some other things you can think of that these names had in common? Great faith in God. That's for sure.
They each had an E in their name.
Each had an E in their name. But I want to give you a hint as to far as my one thing is. God had a plan. Were any of these people religious people and vocational ministers? No, they were all people who had what we would think of as secular positions and secular jobs. And so that's one of the things I think is really cool. They were all basically administrators, or they were in government. They were working sometimes things we think, well, that's not a way that God can use us. And yet these four people were not brought up as ministers, as vocational ministers. They weren't seen in the beginning, at least, as prophets. They all served in what we would think of as secular lay jobs. And yet, would you say that God used these four people very, very as powerfully as anyone else in the Old Testament? And so Daniel, let's begin now. I'm going to flip over here to a map. You can turn back to page 81. I have it up here on the screen. We're going to get a little bit of our timeline just so you'll remember that it's there on page 81. So as we talked about here, you'll see Daniel, just to get these dates, and this kind of starts all the way back just to try to get an order of all the different characters. And I'm also, in a couple weeks, we're going to have our test night. So I'm trying to remind you that this is here so you'll remember that it's there. And so you'll see these two guys are grouped because they're during the Babylonian captivity. And then you can see Ezra and Nehemiah, which we're just talking about. They actually lived when? After Daniel, which sometimes, that's what I'm saying, sometimes it seems like if you're just going through the Bible, you think, well, those guys must have been way before. But remember, these are the books of history, the books of history up there. But Daniel and Ezekiel actually lived before Ezra and Nehemiah, all of these five prophets which are here. These three prophets in those two books of the people when they returned back to Israel. And I'm going to add one thing if you want to add on here. About 480, I'm not going to run on my TV, it's going to be on this side. 480 BC is about the time of Esther, so you can add her to your timeline as well. So even Esther was after the time and the days that we're talking about now. So just to get that in sort of a historical context, here we have, remember, here's old Jeremiah. I said around about 700 BC. All of these are his contemporaries, which we're going to be seeing some of those in the coming 2 weeks. And then we have the fall of Samaria over here. Then we have the fall of Jerusalem. Then we have, I meant to say Isaiah was 700 BC. Then we have Jeremiah, and these two guys are all contemporaries around the fall of the Babylonian captivity. And we also see in the book of Daniel the transition. You remember our kingdoms, they're not on this map, are they? Yeah, they are. The transition from the Assyrian captivity, but then we're going to see the Babylonian captivity. And then in the middle, you remember the writing on the wall? The writing on the wall was to the Babylonian king that says, your days are done. And then we have the Persian Empire, which the Persian Empire, of course, as we put Esther over here, that's the Persian Empire. And so you see in the middle of the book of Daniel, the end of Nebuchadnezzar, his empire, and the beginning of the Persian Empire, which we've talked about before. Okay, top of page 90. Daniel, as we said, was in Babylon. He was in exile from Judah. He apparently taken there as a boy in 606 BC. We talked about those different movements last week. There are 3 times that people were carried away, and he is in one of the earlier ones. A few years earlier than Ezekiel's exile. So Daniel and his group was taken over actually before Ezekiel, who we talked about last week. Daniel was really more of a statesman than a prophet. And of course, we talked about that. He was more of a layperson than a prophet, whereas Ezekiel, who remember, what was Ezekiel trained as before he was exiled? Who can remember from last week? He wouldn't fit in this category, would he? He was trained as a priest in the temple. But Daniel was just a sort of a statesman, or he was part of the royal family, a well-educated young man. Second paragraph, the book of Daniel is in the Old Testament, while the book of Revelation is in the New Testament. And the reason it says that is because both of these are called part of the apocalypse, because the last part of Daniel, we're going to see, has lots of pictures and descriptions that are very similar to the things that we see in Revelation. We're going to look at some of those in a little bit of detail, not a lot. And so Daniel, as we saw last week with Ezekiel, is filled with visions, prophetic visions, and some of them were contemporary to him, some were in the future. And also he has something in common with Joseph. He's going to interpret some dreams. All right, so let's look down to the bottom of page 90. The historical parts of the book, chapters 1 through 6, and there's a lot of familiar stories. Daniel arrives in Babylon, and the king Nebuchadnezzar told his people that I want you to go and I want you to get some of the young, finest people. We're going to ship them out. We've talked about this before. We're going to bring them here to our capital, and we're going to teach them our culture and our ways. They're going to learn how to read our language. They're going to learn how to speak our language. They're going to learn about our gods. They're going to learn about our culture. And of course, the plan is that they would ship them back later after they had sort of indoctrinated and cultured them in the Babylonian culture. He had 3 friends. They're named Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And then these 3 friends' names were changed to, who can guess? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And in that familiar story, you have the Babylonians. He said, I want these young men, fine men, to be brought up, and they're going to live in the best thing. We're going to train them to be leaders, but we want them to lead the way we want them to. So they wanted them, as I said, to be enculturated, and one of those things was how they ate. And, of course, they had idols and all these sorts of things, but those things were forbidden, of course, in the Israelite law. Particularly, they weren't allowed to eat the blood of animals, because in Leviticus 17 it says, the life is in the blood. Right? And I think, have you ever seen the blood coming out of your friend and all of a sudden you felt like, has anybody ever felt woozy when you see your own blood? I think God's kind of built that in. The only time I've ever fainted one time was when I smashed my finger and blood just started coming. I felt like such a, not a tough guy, because I thought my finger was barely bleeding. I was like, I'm going to have to sit down. And I thought, not as tough as I thought I was. But when we see blood, what do we think? It's a problem, right? That's a sign that we have to deal with that. And so God made blood precious, and so we're not to consume blood. And so they did not want to do that. And of course, they took them up to the head eunuch. And we've talked about before, a eunuch is just a man who's been castrated. And often eunuchs were people who worked around the palace and in special places, so that they didn't have to worry about any kind of palace intrigue between the wives and concubines of the king. So the eunuchs were, if you were brought in and to be in a place of honor and authority there, you were often castrated as a man. So they talked to the head eunuch, and he wanted them to eat this, drink wine and eat all these foods. They thought these are the best foods. This is how we eat foods as Chaldeans. And let's see what they asked him. So they asked Melzar, and by the way, it's Melzar in the King James, and then it's also, Melzar could be or just steward, because it actually, Melzar could either be a proper name as it says up there, or if you just translate it, just means a steward. So they asked Melzar, or the steward, to give them vegetables and water for 10 days and see if they were as fit as the others who were eating unclean food. So they weren't able to allow to eat the meat, or they didn't want to eat the meat because none of the meat was killed properly according to how God had said in the Mosaic Law. So they were vegetarians for a time and just drank water. And then what was the result after 10 days? They were in better health. How would we do if we just drank water and vegetables for 10 days? You know, we might look better. I don't know if I want to do it long term, but this is what it says in the follow-up passage, that they looked not just the same as the others, but they looked healthier. And they were brought before the king, and as he gave them tests and questions and so forth, they showed themselves not to just look fit, but they were also shown to be more intelligent than a lot of his magicians and astrologers. And so after these men, by the way, they were to be enculturated for 3 years. That's kind of how the program, they had a 3-year program of these. They'd bring in these people, they would train them for about 3 years. And after he'd finished his training, that 3-year training, there came a test. It's going to sound a little bit like the Joseph story, but it's even tougher than Joseph, because King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he wakes up really upset, but he can't remember what it was. So he calls all of his wise men, his magicians, and he says, I want you to tell me the meaning of my dream, and to up the ante, guess what he said? You got to tell me what the dream was. So I want you to tell me what the dream was and the meaning of the dream. And of course, what is the response of all of his wise people? Excuse me. Whoop, I didn't get there yet. Too early. I jumped ahead there. The response, which we're going to do in just a second, and he gave them a threat. If you don't do it, there's going to be some serious consequences. He must have been really upset at this dream, or really unimpressed with his magicians and astrologers, one of the two. And then, of course, he said, if you do, then I'll give you rewards and status in the kingdom. And so what is the response, excuse me, of all of those wise men? They said, nobody can do that. Are you, it's like, so they kind of formed a little union where they said, we can't do it. Nobody can do it. Nobody's even going to try. No one can do it. And then the king says, okay, I'm going to have if none of you are smart enough to do this, can divine this question, then I'm going to have everyone slain. And then as you see there in the third paragraph down from the bottom, it says, Daniel asked that he might be given time to interpret the dream for the king, and he and his friends seek God. Now, what does it mean to seek God? What do you think about when you think seeking God? They prayed, right? They searched Scripture. They just prayed for, if you were at Sunday's sermon, we are commanded to pray for something, right? If you ask for this thing, you will be given without reproach. Wisdom. So it seems like they knew that. So they asked for wisdom. Then Daniel gets the meaning of the dream. You can see the passage there in chapter 2. When he tells the dream and its meaning to the king, how does King Nebuchadnezzar reward Daniel when he's able to not just tell him he's able to tell him the content of the dream? It says he gives him many rewards and makes him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, which was probably referring to just the area around the capital city. And then in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar sets up a big idol of himself and commands that everyone should bow down and worship him whenever the music sounds. And the music sounds. And of course the question you ask is, so where's Daniel when this happens? So we're not sure exactly Daniel. He may have been out of town, or maybe he was just of such status that he didn't have to obey it. But as he looked out over the crowd, there were 3 fellows not bowing down. Who were those 3 guys? We've already mentioned them before. Now, are these we just learned this, are these their Hebrew names? No, these are the names that they were given because what they want to do, remember, they're bringing in these people. And by the way, Daniel was actually named Belteshazzar. His name was changed as well. But if you came in, you were one of the smart, bright people, we're going to take control of your country, bring in your smart people. We're going to change their names. We're going to enculturate them, teach them a new religion, new language, and impress them with all the things that we're able to do technologically. And then they're going to become our champions, and then we'll send them back so that they'll rule their own people for us. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego remembered the first commandment. Do you remember the first commandment? It's against idol worship. Matter the first three are all the first three are involved in it there. So they remembered those first commandments, and they would not bow down. And so King Nebuchadnezzar, now they have a fiery furnace, and the fiery furnace was for punishment, or some people think it was also just for sacrifices. So, they did sacrifices to their idols, and so they said, we're going to throw you into the fiery furnace. And this would have been in a public place where they did these demonstrations. So, but they're not just going to do it in a normal way. It says they're going to heat it up. How are they going to heat it up? 7 times the normal temperature. As it says there, not even their hair or their clothes, it says, were singed. And one of the interesting parts in the detail of that story, it says the fire was so hot that the guards who walked up to throw them in died. That's how hot the fire was, that the guards who carried them up there to throw them in, those guards actually perished because the fire was so hot. And another detail you'll probably remember in the story is the king could see into the flames. He said, how many people did we throw in there? Y'all remember that part of the story? He was like, I already forgot. Maybe some of our guards fell in. I don't know what he was thinking about. And he said, because we threw in 3, but he said, I see how many? 4. I see 4. And it says, remember, they're walking around, moving around. What in the world is going on? And you remember the really powerful, faithful statement they said. They said, our Lord will deliver us from this situation. But even if he does not, let everyone know that we will not bow down to anyone except the Lord our God. And so, of course, that had a deep effect on everyone who saw it, including the king. And as you see there, a practical application for us is the Lord may not always keep us out of the furnace, but does he leave us alone? No, he does not. And then you see the transition as we're getting to chapter 6. The end of chapter 5, the beginning of chapter 6, if you want to write this note in your margin, the end of chapter 5 is the end of the Babylonian Empire. That's where we have the writing on the wall in the middle to end part of chapter 5. And so there's a transition. There's a fall of the Babylonian kingdom ends at the end of chapter 5 with the writing on the wall. And then you have the Persians come in. And chapter 6, there's new guys with new names. Darius, Cyrus, those are all Persian guys who come in and take over the whole Babylonian Empire. And that's important because, remember we talked about earlier, Esther, she's going to be married to a Persian emperor. It's going to be, so that's where this transition happens between chapters 5 and 6 when the Babylonians are conquered by the Assyrians. And it's recorded there, and Daniel foretold it. Matter of fact, we have heard that say there's writing on the wall. Now, what do we usually mean if we say the writing was on the wall? It's meant, hey, I saw it. I mean, you could just tell what was about to happen. That's where we get that saying, is he saw the writing on the wall, and the writing said, it's over. This kingdom is done. And then, after that expression was given, it was fulfilled. And then, now, chapter 6. So now we have a new king, right? Apparently doesn't remember the fiery furnace, this new king. And so we have a dramatic story, and if you want to read the details of the story, I'll just summarize it. So they made a law, and they wanted everyone that for 30 days, I believe it was 30 days, y'all can double check it. I was going to say for 30 days, no one could pray to any god or anything except the king. But Daniel had a habit. He was still he was one of the satraps. It's called one of the administrators of the area, very important person. And he had a house apparently in the city that was very visible to other people. And he had a habit. Does anyone remember what that habit was that he would do 3 times a day? He'd go out onto his kind of veranda, is how I kind of imagine it, a place where people could see him. And he would pray 3 times a day. And so then the edict came out that for 30 days you could not pray to anyone except the king. And so I'm sure Daniel's enemies, as Pam was talking about, the enemies that he had, thing to kind of remember back to the Esther story, right? He's kind of being set up. But what does he do? He goes ahead and he continues and he lets everyone know, just like his friends had done before, that he will continue to pray to his God, Jehovah, Yahweh God of Israel. And because he did, whoops, I forgot to put that up there. He was thrown into a den of lions because he prayed to his God in that 30-day period when it was banned. And then we see something that sounds very familiar to the fiery furnace. Was he alone with those lions? No, the Bible says that their angel came and closed the mouths of the lions. God sent an angel to shut the lions' mouths. So once again, we see that it looked like God was not available. He wasn't delivering them in the way that perhaps they would have hoped. But yet, God did not leave them alone. He did deliver them. And so we see in that first kingdom, God uses the fiery furnace incident so that his name is glorified among the Babylonians. That's why I made the point of that shift in the kingdom. So now this happens in the Persian times. Now in the Persian times, he's going to glorify himself among the Persians in the even bigger Persian Empire. And then we see the transition to chapter 7. We go from the historical stories that we've often heard, the familiar stories. Now we go into the prophetic. And now we're going to look at some of these, and we're going to do it very succinctly, I should say, because there are a lot of ideas and opinions on these, but we're just going to look at them briefly. I'm going to get my Bible here for just a second. And the one I want to highlight that it's in this first section in chapter 7. If you don't have this, this is very, very important. Because Jesus' favorite name that he referred to himself as is the Son of Man. So you wonder where it's the title. And so where did that title come from? And it comes from Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. So I want you to make that note highlight that in your book. It's not there in your notes, but make that highlight because this is critical. So you say, why does Jesus call himself the Son of Man? It's a title, and here's where it comes from. I'm going to read verses 13 and 14 in chapter 7. So I saw in the night visions, this is Daniel talking about what he's seen, and behold, the clouds of heaven, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a Son of Man. And he came up to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom. Now listen, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. So is this a normal earthly human being? No. He's given an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. And so that is when Jesus said Son of Man, the Pharisees knew exactly why he kept referring to him, because he's referring to that title that's given to this. He looked into heaven and he saw one that appeared like a Son of Man. It's a little bit mysterious, but Son of Man just means look like a human being in heaven. And this one that looked like a human being in heaven comes up to Jehovah God, the Ancient of Days, and to him was given authority and kingdom over all peoples, and he was set as a ruler over, given an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom will not be destroyed. So there we have it. So mark that. That is, when you wonder why does Jesus refer to himself as Son of Man, it's that particular reference right there. Now continue in chapter 7. Daniel's been interpreting dreams for others, it says, but now he has visions of his own. He sees 4 beasts in his dream. Who does Daniel say these beasts represent? There'll be 4 kings. So is this, remember we talked about a couple different things that prophets do. Sometimes prophets just sort of define what's happening right now. They'll say, we must repent. If we don't, this is going to happen. They're sort of giving a judgment sort of thing. But now this is a little bit different. He's actually seeing this vision kind of the future of what's going to happen, similar to what we saw with Ezekiel. He sees these 4 beasts, and then he tells us in that passage that it represents 4 kings. So now I'm not going to go into this too much because there are different ideas and theories on what it is, but we'll just talk about some generalizations that are here. As it says there's much disagreement on exactly which 4 empires the beasts represent. But here is probably the most widely accepted one, that the lion is Babylon. Now remember, Babylon has just passed away, right? He's just watched Babylonian Empire. Then the bear is who conquered the Babylonians? Persia, that's exactly right. So in that Persian Empire, that was King Cyrus, and then eventually Xerxes, which would be the king who would select Esther. And then the Persians were conquered by a young man and his army who was only about 25 years old. Who was that guy? Alexander the Great. So that's been in a lot of Hollywood movies. Alexander the Great from Greek. They defeat them, eventually come all the way to Babylon, conquer them. And when he was still a young man, he dies. And then when he dies, his 4 sub-generals divide things up, and that eventually it becomes so disorganized that it's conquered by the final empire, which is the empire whenever Jesus comes, which is the Roman Empire. And the 4th beast, as it says, is different from any of the previous ones because it's considered dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly and has great iron teeth. The Roman Empire, whereas the other ones would only last a few hundred years, the Roman Empire lasted over 1,000 years. Isn't that just unbelievable that there could be a government, something that can last over, as a matter of fact, close to 1,500 years before it was finally finished. And of course, the remnants of that are still here. Top of page 93. In chapter 9, verses 20-27, God speaks to Daniel again through the angel Gabriel. Now, what is Daniel doing when God sends Gabriel to speak to him? What is he doing? And what lesson can this give us today? He's doing 2 things. What are the 2 things it says he's doing? I'll just read the passage, chapter. He's praying and confessing. And it's an interesting thing that we see over and over in the Bible is the people who are closest to God are often the most humble. Isn't that an interesting observation? You'd think people that are closer to God would be kind of puffed up. Like, well, I'm close to God. I get to have these visions. I see God. You'd think about that. You remember Moses? He was called the most humble man in the nation. And of course, all the other prophets that came to face, like Daniel with God in these visions, what's he doing? Is because he knows there may come another vision. He's praying, but he's not just praying. He's confessing his sin. So if we want to be close to God, we must, as Scripture tells us, humble ourselves and pray. And then you can see there's lots of numbers and references, and there have been many people try to take this and turn it into some sort of mathematical equation to figure out when Jesus is coming back. And so if you ever read or you hear on TV or somebody said, I've got it figured out, there's one thing I can tell you for sure. They're wrong. Okay? They're wrong. And so we don't know. No one knows the day or the hour. So if anybody tries to add up all these dates and weeks and all this sort of thing, and it's happened many, many times. As a matter of fact, in colonial America, there's a lot of the different sects that start off. They would start because people they had what they thought a prophet. He declared that, or there were some women and some men that said, I've figured it out. I've added it all up. And they would all go out and leave and try to create their little utopia and expecting that Jesus was going to return on the date. And the dates were a combination of these passages in Daniel with some of the passages in Revelation. But, as I said, no one knows the time or the date. So beware any of those Bible codes or adding up things or secret things. Those are often just to sell books. Or sometimes people are genuine that they believe it, but they're genuinely mistaken, I would say. And then you can see down there it says Daniel has another vision in chapter 10. There are many visions, which describes an encounter with a man clothed in linen, whose loins are girded. Now, what does that mean, loins are girded?
Ready for battle, ready to move.
Yeah, so back then, the men would wear these long kind of robes. So if you needed to run, the first thing you'd have to do, they have your belt, you'd pick up your bottom of your robe, and you would tuck it into your belt. So when they say gird your loins, it means to take the stuff that's covering up your legs. It means, like you're saying, getting ready for action. Getting ready for action. We had an older mentor of ours, and he would use that term a lot, and I thought, what in the world is he talking about? But whenever life was getting tough, that's what he'd say. This time you need to gird up your loins. And that means you better get ready. And he would, maybe I'm going to start using that. I may bring that one back. He'd say, you better go gird up your loins, son. And that means get ready for action. So he said, there was a man clothed in linen whose loins were girded, which means they were ready for action, with fine gold of Uphaz. The similarity of Daniel 5:15 and Revelation is too simply to be overlooked. From the reading of the two passages, whom would one conclude Daniel encounters in this vision? And you'll see a box over there that's a revision. So the author, and this is where it's hard to describe, but this is why it's a lifelong study. Early in the book, the first edition of the book, he says it's Jesus. But then when you start looking at it, you see that in the passage, in this passage, that the person that appears is asking for help from Michael. So do you think Jesus would need to ask an angel for help to subdue demons? No, he wouldn't need help. And so even though that picture is similar, it is probably, let me put this up there, it might have been the Lord Jesus that he was seeing, but most probably it was an angel, one of the powerful angels. And this is an example of just the mystery that's there. There are lots of mysteries in the Bible. And as we talked about when we were talking about the first chapters of Genesis, a lot of people, same thing, will try to turn to some sort of technical explanation, but here's what I think. We all get to heaven, we're all going to say, we were all wrong. We were all wrong. Because when we're able to have this information, this heavenly perspective, there's so much that we don't know that it's impossible really for us to get it right. And so I think that's a problem you'll get into if you get to try to technically didect and put all these things in different ways. Then you're always going to have mistakes because we don't have all the information, and that is called a mystery. It is true, but it is a mystery because of our limited capacity. And then you can see stuff talks about the tribulation, which is mentioned in chapter 12, and the final question at the bottom, the reason Daniel cannot understand all this prophecy and why we can't understand it, he says in chapter 12, verse 9. I'll read that. Is it near the close of the book? He said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up. That means the meaning, the thing that he wanted to read is shut up or closed up, and it is sealed until the time of the end. Which means that I've given you this, but it's going to seem mysterious because the full meaning of all that you've seen is sealed until the end of time. Are there any questions or comments? The book of Daniel.